A brief conversation with Nathan Stock will demonstrate his expertise in the Israel-Palestine crisis. He notes the fact that the United States underwrites 2/3 of Israel's military budget. He sees the danger in allowing Israel to flout standards the international community set after World War II to deter war. He has a firm grasp on how internal Palestinian division has hindered the achievement of peace in the region. But underneath it all, it is his deep love for the people, both the Israelis and the Palestinians, that undergirds his ongoing efforts to seek a better reality for all who live in that troubled land. Nathan was in his early 20s when curiosity sparked by an undergraduate class in Middle East history led him to seek work in Gaza. 6 months later, the Second Intifada broke out. Still, he remained for 2 years, working with a Palestinian organization to design and fundraise for conflict resolution programs targeting the Palestinian community. After various positions in international development, Nathan joined the Carter Center, studying the Fatah-Hamas conflict and seeking political solutions to the Syrian civil war. From late 2013 until June of this year, Nathan was director of the Israel-Palestine Office of the Carter Center in Jerusalem. Among many accomplishments during that time, his most significant work may be his work to reconcile Fatah and Hamas, who announced an agreement last month that was greeted positively by many international observers. He currently serves as a senior associate with the Middle East Institute, which published Nathan's analysis of the Fatah-Hamas agreement called "The Palestinian Quest for Reconciliation, Can It Be Achieved?" I have a feeling he will address that question in his remarks today. Please join me in welcoming Nathan Stock.
First, let me just extend deep thanks to Northfielders for Justice in Palestine, Israel for the invitation. You've obviously put together a great program today, and it's a pleasure to be here. As Allison said, I'm a non-resident associate with the Middle East Institute out of Washington, and until recently, I directed the Israel-Palestine office of the Carter Center. Today, I'd like to use my time to take a deep dive into the history and current reality of the Gaza Strip. This is a topic that I know well. I lived there for 2 years in the early 2000s for the first 2 years of the Second Palestinian Uprising. It's also been a key focus of my work with the Carter Center and my current research with the Middle East Institute. But I also want to talk about Gaza because it's isolated. Could you raise your hand if you've had the opportunity to visit Israel or the West Bank? That's what I thought. Could you raise your hand if you visited Gaza? That's actually better than I expected. In my experience, Gaza makes the news in the United States when Gaza and Israel go to war, but otherwise, this strip along the Mediterranean has been deliberately sidelined. In the course of my 3.5 years in Jerusalem with the Carter Center, I regularly met visiting U.S. activist groups, church groups, twice a month maybe. I would often give talks, particularly on Gaza. And the vast majority of those folks, of course, were denied the opportunity to visit Gaza as part of a deliberate policy by the Israeli government to keep the territory closed off. But not only that, Gaza has been a side note, at least since the latter portion of the Bush administration, since the late 2000s, and throughout the Obama administration in terms of U.S. diplomacy on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. After the 2006 Palestinian election, really throughout the Obama years, the United States attempted to pursue a bilateral Israeli-Palestinian agreement with the government of Palestinian President Abbas, and really without any serious focus on what would happen to Gaza, on the erroneous assumption that A, somehow they could bring about a peace agreement, and then B, they could shoehorn Gaza into that later. So I think these are all very good reasons to spend an hour or so talking about Gaza. Before we get into what Gaza looks like today and where it might be going, I think it's important to give just a little bit of historical background. Can anybody here tell me, just raise your hand, how is it that we ended up with this admittedly odd piece of geography? To my knowledge, it's the only territory in the world that we refer to as a strip, almost like it's a steak, like a strip of anything. Why do we have a Gaza Strip? Anybody know?
UN partition plan.
Actually, no. That's okay. The 47 UN partition plan envisioned a strip along the coast being part of the Palestinian state. Of course, that was never realized. But the border in the plan does not correspond to the current border of the Gaza Strip. That border is just an armistice line. That piece of territory was, in effect, an Egyptian army salient into Israeli lines that was kept in place when the war ended. That is how Egypt took over administration of this odd little territory after the 48 war. Anyone know the population of Gaza? 2 million. Yeah, they're up to 2 million now. 2 million, 2/3 of whom are refugees or their descendants from the 1948 war. Egypt was careful to ensure that the thousands of Palestinian refugees that flooded into their lines, behind Egyptian lines during the war, stayed within what had been Palestinian territory. Egypt was careful not to settle any Palestine refugees on its side of the border. So there's no significant Palestinian refugee population west of the border. They were all clustered in this salient controlled by the Egyptian army, which is why 2/3 of the population of the Gaza Strip today are refugees, and it's why the territory is so crowded. Mind you, this is a territory that's 140 square miles. That's about twice the size of the District of Columbia. It's 25 miles long, 4 to 5 miles wide. That's not a lot of real estate to squeeze 2 million people into, especially when you consider that most of them live in housing that's no more than 3 stories. Okay, so as you all know, continuing our very abbreviated history lesson, the next very significant event in the history of Gaza, of course, is the 1967 war, when Israel conquered the territory. Does anyone know what year the first Israeli restrictions on the movement of Gazans, of Palestinians from Gaza, were put in place? Feel free to shout out. 91. Thanks to my fellow panelists. That's right. You know, there has been very rightly a lot of international concern about what the Israeli government calls their policy of closure of Gaza, what Palestinians call the siege of Gaza, particularly since the late 2000s, when that closure reached its zenith. But that discussion sometimes misses the fact that the closure of Gaza is something that has been building for a very long time. The first restrictions on movement of Palestinians from Gaza were put in place in 1991. Before 91, Palestinians from Gaza could work in Israel. They could move in and out of Gaza without any sort of permit. They needed, in theory, a work permit to have legal work in Israel, though many also worked illegally. But movement itself was not restricted. And it's important to keep in mind that this was not a coincidence. This was part of a deliberate policy put in place by Moshe Dayan, the Israeli defense minister in charge in '67. It was the open bridges policy. And it was not an act of charity. Dayan's thinking was, we will encourage Palestinians to work in Israel. They will make money. Their standard of living will improve, and that will diffuse their nationalism. They won't want to fight us if we give them jobs. That was the basic idea behind the open bridges policy. So this was a part of a set of economic policies that not only allowed freedom of movement for Palestinian labor, but deliberately stymied the development of industry or agriculture in the West Bank and Gaza that might compete with Israeli producers. It created amongst Palestinians a captive market for Israeli goods, while also a pool of what they called black labor, pool of kind of impoverished laborers who increasingly were drawn into the service sector and the construction sector in Israel. It is important to consider that in the 1980s, unemployment in Gaza barely hit 5%. Anyone know what the unemployment rate in Gaza is today? Right. It's been up to 42%, a rate that the World Bank has said is the highest in the world. But in the 1980s, it barely hit 5%. So keep in mind that as miserable as conditions are in Gaza today, there are many people there who remember a very different time. So, next big event in our quick tour of modern history, of course, is the Oslo Accords, beginning in 1994. Israel withdrew from about 60% of the Gaza Strip in '94. They retained direct control over 40% of the territory, home at that time to around 8,000 Israeli settlers. Then in '96, you had the first elections for this new Palestinian government that had been set up to administer this limited autonomous Palestinian territory. In '96, Yasser Arafat was elected president of this new Palestinian government, and a legislature for this Palestinian government was also elected. The other thing that happened in '94, which is not widely appreciated, is that the first border fence around Gaza was built by Israel. So as of '94, along with the peace process, and then in '96 and a legislature and all that, Palestinians got their first fence. I moved to Gaza in March of 2000, when I was 23. And when I got there, the vast majority of Palestinians from Gaza were already stuck there. It was an open-air prison, certainly by 2000. Before the Second Intifada, which broke out in September of 2000, there were still around 30,000 Palestinian laborers from Gaza going into Israel every day. You could get a permit for education in the West Bank. You could get a permit for medical care. Sometimes you could get a permit for family visitation if you had family in the West Bank or Israel. But most people before the Second Intifada could not leave. Of course, the Second Intifada breaks out. Those 30,000 laborers, that quickly stopped. The vast majority of people couldn't move once the Second Intifada started. This war went into 2004, left over 3,000 Palestinians and over 1,000 Israelis dead. This, of course, is the conflict that saw massive and horrific Palestinian suicide bombings targeting Israeli civilians. It also saw the systematic bombardment by Israel of Palestinian population centers, and eventually the reoccupation of most Palestinian urban centers in the West Bank. Next big milestone is 2005. 2005, Israel withdrew its settlers and security forces from the interior of the Gaza Strip. Interior is the operative term here. Israel, in 2005, did not attempt to make Gaza sovereign. Gaza is not a sovereign state. I may be preaching to the choir on this point, but it's worth underlining. Israel, to the present, continues to control Gaza's coastline, its airspace. When I moved to Gaza, Gaza had a functioning commercial airport. Planes are not allowed to fly out of Gaza these days. Israel controls Gaza's electromagnetic spectrum, its population registry. Babies born in Gaza are still registered and receive ID cards out of an Israeli-run database. So, though Israel pulled its settlers out and its security forces out, Israel retained control of Gaza after 2005 and to the present. Israel's Gaza policy today is the same as their closure of Bethlehem, ringed as Bethlehem is by a wall. It's the same thing, just on a larger scale. So, the other thing that happened in 2005, of course, was the death of Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat. A presidential election was held in 2005 to elect Mahmoud Abbas, who succeeded Arafat. And then a few months later, in January of 2006, legislative elections were held for overdue parliamentary elections for the legislative body of the Palestinian Authority. Hamas won 76 out of 132 seats, which was enough to allow them to form the next Palestinian government. Hamas selected a prime minister and seated a cabinet, in keeping with Palestinian law. It's important to keep in mind that this election was, more than anything else, a vote against Fatah. Fatah, of course, was the party of Arafat, the party of Abbas, the party that had dominated Palestinian politics since the 1960s, and was corrupt, and was seen, certainly by 2006, as a bit of a spent political force. There was a real desire for change on the part of Palestinians, and Hamas did a good job, frankly a much better job than Fatah, of fielding good candidates, but also ensuring that they were not running against themselves. Fatah by 2006, and very much today, is quite divided internally. So Fatah in the 2006 election handicapped itself by effectively dividing its own vote. I mean, that's why Hamas ended up with the vote total that it did. So Hamas seats the new government, and in response, at the urging of the Bush administration, the Quartet for Middle East Peace, that is the US, Russia, the EU, and the UN, articulated a policy known as the Quartet Conditions. So the Quartet said that the new Hamas-backed government had to do three things. It had to de jure recognize Israel, it had to renounce violence, and it had to accept prior peace agreements that had been signed between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization. On the face of it, the international community, many in the activist community, no one had a problem, many did not have a problem per se with the conditions. Of course, we would all like to see peace. It would be nice at some point if Israel and Palestine recognized that. The problem was that these conditions were deliberately articulated in such a way as to be unimplementable by Hamas. least Hamas saw itself. I have spoken to diplomats who were involved in these conversations at the time. Former boss President Carter spoke out against this plan at the Quartet meeting when this was adopted in early 2006. There were reasonable grounds for concern at the time that the international community was putting in place a policy framework that would be self-defeating and very hard to implement. Nevertheless, the Bush administration, the same Bush administration that is a large part of the reason why those elections happened in the first place, turned around and imposed a set of policies that would be unimplemented by the new, very democratically elected Palestinian government. So, as per the plan, the Hamas-backed government turns around and refuses to accept what they call the Quartet conditions, not the Quartet principles. And that, in turn, leads to a boycott, a diplomatic boycott of this new, democratically elected Palestinian government. The diplomatic boycott comes together with a significant cut in foreign aid, aid from the US, to some extent aid from the EU, and a cut in tax revenues transferred from the State of Israel to Palestine. Not to get too into the weeds, but Palestine, of course, is not sovereign. The Palestinian government's not sovereign. It doesn't control any borders. So if you're an importer in Ramallah who imports goods from Sweden, Israel collects those customs revenues at its border crossings, and those Palestinian tax revenues are transferred to the Palestinian government on a monthly basis. Those monies make up a huge portion of the operating budget of the Palestinian government. And Israel stopped those transfers as soon as the Palestinians elected a government it didn't like. The combination of the cut of Israeli revenue, of Palestinian revenue transferred by Israel, and foreign aid immediately put the Palestinian Authority government in the red and meant that it couldn't pay salaries of its civil servants. This matters because Palestine's not a free country. Movement of goods and services is a problem. It does not have a thriving private sector. The public sector, the Palestinian Authority government, is the largest employer in the West Bank and Gaza. So very quickly, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians weren't receiving their paychecks. So the decisions made by the international community after this election put in place painful external pressures on this democratically elected government. These external pressures exacerbated internal tensions. There were people in Fatah who lost that election. Fatah, of course, the party of President Abbas, the party that had dominated politics for so long, that were less than enamored with the fact that they had suffered this defeat at the ballot box. And as 2006 wore on, there was growing violence between security forces and armed partisans backed by either Hamas or Fatah. This bubbled over in the summer of 2007 into a week-long Palestinian civil war, for lack of a better term. And when the dust settled, Hamas had routed Fatah-backed fighters in Gaza, and in the 18% of the West Bank where the Palestinian Authority has security control, security forces loyal to President Abbas had driven Fatah underground. President Abbas promptly accused Hamas of having launched a coup. He declared the elected Hamas-backed government illegal and formed a new emergency government. This meant that from 2007 to 2014, Palestine, which still doesn't have a free country between it, had two governments, two prime ministers, two foreign ministers, the whole slate. And it was also in this period that the closure of Gaza, what Palestinians call the siege, reached its zenith. In 2006, a guy named Dov Weisglass, an advisor to then Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, famously said, and I quote, that the idea is to put Palestinians on a diet, Palestinians in Gaza, but not to make them die of hunger. It later emerged that the Israeli military had internal documentation estimating that people in Gaza needed to consume 2,300 calories per day, and that this estimate may have been the basis for calculating the number of truckloads that was allowed into Gaza of foodstuffs. The Israeli army, when this came to light after a court battle, denied that these memos were actually the basis for the calculation of trucks going in. But nevertheless, the documentation was there. Regardless, I can tell you that in the aftermath of the 2008-2009 Gaza war, aid workers had to fight to get macaroni into Gaza, because macaroni was considered by Israel as a dual-use item. And this is where it's important to take a little sidebar onto dual-use items. So when they say dual-use, and this is not solely an Israeli term, they mean things that could be used for either civilian or military purposes. Israel did not invent this term. Globally, dual-use items are regulated by something called the Wassenaar Arrangement on Export Controls for Conventional Arms and Dual-Use Goods and Technologies. This treaty was signed by the US, Russia, Japan, most EU member countries in '96. I've even read parts of it. It regulates everything from certain forms of plutonium to conventional weapons. Israel is not a party to the Wassenaar Arrangement. And when Israel talks about dual-use items, it's something else entirely. When Israel talks about preventing the entry into Gaza or regulating the entry into Gaza of dual-use items, at least in 2008, it was talking about pasta. Today, plywood, thicker than 1 centimeter, as far as Israel is concerned in Gaza, is a dual-use item. Wire for soldering is a dual-use item. Concrete is a dual-use item. This matters because this is the closure of Gaza. This is the bureaucratic backbone of the policy framework that ensures that 80% of the people in Gaza are dependent on foreign assistance. This is why Gaza cannot develop a healthy, normal, functioning economy. Gaza used to export things, strawberries, furniture. This is why these things are virtually impossible. A few years back, 2 years ago now, to some fanfare, Israel ended its restriction on exports from Gaza of furniture, which is good. It's real good. Shortly thereafter, it said you couldn't import plywood thicker than 1 centimeter. Since Gaza is not blessed with verdant pine forests, this is a problem, right? So it is these policies that matter, not questions of infrastructure. So much of the discussion around the closure of Gaza is sidetracked around how to get things into Gaza. This past summer, not long before we left, I spent a day at a conference at the Israeli Institute for National Security Studies, the most well-known, well-regarded security think tank in Israel, a day-long symposium on issues related to Gaza. Probably half the participants were Israelis. And the opening of one of the sessions I participated in was kicked off with a 15-minute presentation by a very well-respected ex-Israeli general, a very bright guy, who spent 15 minutes outlining a plan for building an artificial island off the coast of Gaza, which would include an airport and cargo facilities and would be connected to Gaza by a causeway and cost God knows how much money. And he finished his remarks without saying one word about what kinds of things Israel would allow in and out of this stupid island. Of course, Israel would control the thing, right? That goes without saying, though he mentioned that. And this is what matters, right? It's cheaper and more efficient to bring cargo for Gaza, or the West Bank for that matter, to the Israeli port at Ashdod and then truck it into Gaza. In the 90s, the international community spent lots of money on a highly efficient cargo terminal at a place called Karni, east of Gaza City. A few years ago, the Dutch government, in an effort to help Gaza exports, gave Israel a super high-tech, fancy Dutch cargo scanner that would allow you to x-ray whole containers of things going out of Gaza to ensure that they don't contain anything nefarious. And the Israelis, of course, never used it. Caused a little bit of a kerfuffle with the Dutch. So don't get sidetracked on this conversation about how we bring it in new ports. It's about what will Israel allow in and out of Gaza. Will Israel allow Palestinians to bring in the things you need to make things and export things, from agricultural products to manufactured goods. Okay, so sorry for that detour, but I think it's important. Back to our history lesson. So the closure is reaching its zenith in the early 2000s, but Gaza in those days had a safety valve. And that safety valve came in the form of tunnels. Smuggling tunnels under the border between Gaza and Egypt. Now, smuggling between Gaza and Egypt, that probably goes back to time immemorial, but given the dire economic conditions, the closure from Israel, and the fact, as I alluded to earlier, that Israel had designed the economy of Gaza to be subordinate to and connected with the Israeli economy, when Israel cut all that off, it was a huge problem. Consumer goods, electronics, computers, construction materials, food products. There were all kinds of things that you couldn't get after the closure reached its peak. So Palestinians, being smart, industrious folks, began to dig. And I mean dig. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tunnels connected Gaza and the Egyptian Sinai. Hamas organized and regulated this traffic of goods. The egress of these tunnels into Gaza was fenced off in a custom zone. Every pack of cigarette, every sheep, every cars were driven through and sold in Gaza, was taxed by the Hamas authorities. And those taxes, what amounted to customs revenues, right, were the key thing that allowed Hamas to pay its civil servants. After the 07 division, not to get too sidetracked, but the Palestinian president ordered PA employees in Gaza to stop working, which was unfortunate. And so Hamas was forced to hire and train teachers and nurses and folks like that, and find a way to pay them. And it managed to do that, to its credit, mostly based on these revenue, these taxes it collected on these smuggled goods. But in the summer of 2013, Mohammed Morsi, who was then the president of Egypt, who came out of the Muslim Brotherhood, of course Hamas is the Palestinian affiliate of the Muslim Brotherhood, Mohammed Morsi was overthrown. And the new regime that took power in Cairo was utterly opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood. They saw the Muslim Brotherhood as their arch enemy. They blamed the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and outside of Egypt, very much including Hamas in Gaza, for all of Egypt's woes. And the new regime, eventually under President Sisi, the current president of Egypt, moved robustly to close every single tunnel they could find. They bulldozed hundreds of homes, Egyptian homes, on the Egyptian side of the Rafah border. They created a swath of destruction, as Israel once did when it controlled the border. And that caused an enormous new crisis in Gaza. It immediately put a huge dent in the construction sector, really the most vibrant part of the Palestinian economy in Gaza. That was almost wiped out once they lost access to affordable Egyptian construction materials, fuel became scarce, but not only that, Hamas lost that source of revenue. The taxes that they were collecting on those goods coming in, that also dried up. And for the first time since the 07 division, Hamas couldn't pay its people. We're talking 40,000, some say more, depending on how you count it. They couldn't pay those people. This for them is a huge problem. It's in part an economic problem because all of these revenue sources ripple onto one another, right? And just add to the misery. They add to less liquidity in the economy. But it was a political problem for Hamas as well because it dented their prestige. They could no longer claim to be managing this situation despite the difficulties they faced. So, and I started with the Carter Center in 2009, and I was in and out of the West Bank and Gaza. Throughout this period, I was engaging with the Egyptians. A key focus of my work throughout this time was attempting to help the international community facilitate the reunification of the Palestinian political system. I was in and out of Cairo, especially after the revolution there in 2011. And I watched Hamas officials grapple with the reality of Morsi's overthrow in the summer of 2013 and after, and into 2014. And eventually, as they couldn't find any other way out of their mess, it forced them to compromise. So in the spring of 2014, Hamas, in many ways, knuckled under to their Palestinian rivals, to President Abbas and his Fatah party. And they agreed to dissolve their government. This cabinet that had sat in Gaza under a prime minister named Haniya, they gave it up, and they agreed to allow Abbas, in effect, to pick a new government, ostensibly a unified government, that they blessed. They weren't in that government. That government had no Hamas people. It's more or less the same government that the Palestinians have today. But they, from the outside, gave it their blessing. This was a significant concession. And the most immediate thing that Hamas believed they were getting in exchange for this concession was that this new unified government would take over that bill for those salaries, those civil servants in Gaza that they couldn't afford anymore. Who was right and wrong about who said what in this agreement? I don't want to get into that, but very quickly it began to unravel because just a couple months after the agreement was signed and the new government was formed, weeks after the new government was formed, employees of the Palestinian Authority got their paychecks, and those employees that Hamas had hired, they didn't get paid. And Hamas was affronted. They argued that Abbas and his people were not doing what they said. Of course, Abbas's people said the opposite. Now we're into June of 2014. A couple weeks later, you had two Israeli teenagers kidnapped in the West Bank. It later emerged that Israel had reason to believe that these two poor kids were killed very, very quickly after their abduction, within minutes. But their bodies were not found. And Netanyahu rather cynically exploited the idea that these two poor kids were alive somewhere to launch a huge crackdown on Hamas in the West Bank, the most significant such crackdown since the early 2000s. So by late June, going into July, for Hamas, they had two problems. They had made significant concessions to their Palestinian rivals, and from their perspective got nothing in return. They felt that they had been cheated. And they were facing a huge crackdown in the West Bank. And so in a way that had not been true before, after July 6, when an Israeli airstrike killed 5 Hamas guys in a tunnel, they made a premeditated decision to go to war. And they threw everything they had against Israel. Rockets, and they sent divers in, and people through tunnels, and things I'm sure you saw in the news. And they said very explicitly that they were not fighting for the liberation of Jerusalem or the return of Palestinian refugees. They said they were fighting for basic freedom of movement for Palestinians in Gaza. And that's why they held out for 51 days. I went down to Gaza during one of the ceasefires during that war. And I was in contact with Hamas officials during the war. I was relaying messages from Hamas to diplomats. And the official I met, during that ceasefire said just that to me. They made the decision to use force, and I don't want to sugarcoat that. They were launching rockets against Israeli civilians. I mean, they were targeting civilians. It's perfectly legitimate in our current parlance to call those acts of terrorism. I have no problem with that. I don't want to excuse what they did, but I want to explain the thinking. The thinking was, we have tried these different avenues of political compromise. We've gotten nowhere. Our back's against the wall, so we're going to throw a Hail Mary. And that also didn't work. The war ended on ceasefire terms that really gave them nothing. There were not even serious ceasefire negotiations. There were 2 days of talks that were aborted by Jewish and Muslim holidays. And that was it. So by October of 2014, the status quo in Gaza was basically the same as the status quo that created conditions that led to the war. And of course, the war left 2,200 Palestinians, 70 Israelis dead, and much of Gaza in ruins. So the next big event, and I'm laying all this out, I think, for a reason, that may have been under the radar here. There was a few days of cross-border fighting in May of 2016. It was the only occasion since the 2014 war when Hamas itself, Hamas's armed wing, fired mortars and other things at Israeli military units. There have been rockets at other times, but these are always small Salafi jihadist groups that Hamas, in the main, has really kept in check. May of 2016, there were Israeli military units, armored vehicles operating well inside of Gaza and destroying tunnels. And Hamas directly targeted those assets in a careful way. They were careful to try not to spark a larger conflagration. And the two sides fought across the border for about 4 days. A Palestinian woman, a civilian, was killed in an Israeli airstrike. And then those Israeli military units pulled out. The tunnels they wanted to destroy were destroyed, and it stopped. I went down to Gaza shortly after that, and I spoke to a very senior Hamas security official, the head of all Hamas internal security in Gaza. And I asked him about it. Why did this happen? What does it mean? What's going to happen next? And he said at the time that the situation in Gaza was, and I quote, the most difficult ever. The pain that people were experiencing was, quote, equal to or worse than the pain of another war. He said, any spark could ignite an explosion, and that it would not be, and I quote, an internal explosion. Now let's be very clear, the Hamas regime in Gaza is by no means democratic. They have an unaccountable security force that they use to suppress their political rivals, sometimes with violence. Make no mistake about that. And the guy who's telling me this is the guy in charge of that. He was making very clear that Hamas, and I knew this from prior experience, does not need to fear some internal uprising of Palestinians who are frustrated with their autocratic rule. There's this theory, it's been true among the U.S. administrations in the past, that Hamas would be toppled in Gaza. Many of the Fatah types in Ramallah seem to believe that one of these days Hamas would fall because Palestinians there were so fed up with them. Never ever believe that. Hamas has about a third of the population in Gaza that supports them, and the others who don't support them are really under the thumb. That's it. Can't foresee anything that's going to change that. So he said, the situation is so bad, this is May of 2016, that there will be an explosion and it will vent not internally, but to quote this guy Abu Naim, it will vent against the enemy. I'm sure you can imagine who that is. And we don't want war, but this could happen. That's what he said. Now, it's important to understand the conditions at that exact moment. Okay, on the one hand, Israel had been destroying the one thing that Hamas views as a strategic military asset. The only thing they have, they believe, that is a deterrent, a military deterrent to Israel, is the tunnels. And Israel was bulldozing them. From their perspective, I'm not endorsing this, but this is their thinking, that was problem number one. Problem number two, in May of 2016, all cement imports into Gaza had stopped. At the moment of my conversation, they had been stopped for about 6 weeks. That has huge negative ripple effects for the whole economy. By some accounts, it dented Hamas's revenue, because Hamas manages to make a nickel until recently on just about everything that comes into Gaza. And in my experience, it is that combination, those two things. These are the indicators to watch going forward. If you want to understand what constellation of factors could tip Israel and Gaza back into war, it is Hamas's assessment of the efficacy of its military assets, its military deterrent, and its economic conditions. Its revenue, its ability to pay its bills. They are also monitoring, for lack of a better term, what I call the general public misery. But that's not an immediate concern, because the misery of the public, and it's terrible and cynical and sad to say, but that is not what would directly trigger a war. It is their own status, their ability to maintain their administration, and what they perceive to be their military deterrence. And at that moment, those two things were being imperiled. So to me, this highlights, and this is still true now, how quickly things can go south. It is true, the conventional wisdom that you hear in Israel, among Israeli analysts, among Palestinians also, that Hamas is deterred from going back to war with Israel, it's true. Hamas does not want another war. They know they can't afford it. People in Gaza can't afford it. It is true to a point. But you can also envision, unfortunately, the set of conditions that could again push Hamas to conclude that another war is their least bad option. Never lose sight of this unfortunate reality. But more recently, and for once, it's very rare that I do this, but I'm going to end this talk on a high note. I never get to do that. It's so exciting. Something's changed. A few things changed more recently. You may have seen in the news, it got some coverage here, that on October 3rd, Palestinian Prime Minister, a guy named Hamdallah, chaired a meeting of the Palestinian cabinet in Gaza. The whole cabinet met in Gaza. First time that's happened since 2014. He entered Gaza to great fanfare. He entered Gaza with, or later in the day, the head of Egyptian general intelligence. His meeting and his arrival in Gaza was accompanied by a video message from the Egyptian President Sisi, where President Sisi emphasized the importance of reconciling Fatah and Hamas and made it clear that he sees this reunification of Palestine as a step toward a peace agreement between Israelis and Palestinians. A week later or so, after marathon talks in Cairo on October 12th, Fatah and Hamas announced a reconciliation agreement. This Fatah-Hamas reconciliation thing is, again, it's like the thing I did for a living for many years. This is the 8th such agreement. And this agreement listed a number of milestones that were to be met. It was predicated around what appeared to be a gradual process of Hamas handing over to the Palestinian Authority control of Gaza. The first milestone was supposed to be met this past Wednesday, November 1st. Hamas was supposed to hand over to the Palestinian Authority border crossings between Gaza, Israel, and Egypt. And they did. I published an article about that on Wednesday, and I sent it to Allison and Adam, and perhaps they can share it. And sad as it is to say, this is literally the single most positive step toward the reunification of Palestine since their civil war 10 years ago. This is the first and frankly only real, tangible thing they have done to advance the institutional reunification of the Palestinian Authority between the West Bank and Gaza. How did this happen? Well, there are a few things going on here. Partly, in the last few months, especially since the spring of this year, the situation in Gaza, always bad, has been worse than usual. And that's bad, right? This is because in the spring, President Abbas imposed a set of what can only be called financial sanctions against Gaza, against really the civilian population in Gaza. All these years since 2007, the PA, the government, had continued to pay salaries of the civil servants on its payroll in Gaza. They did other things to facilitate medical transfers and certain subsidies of fuel and things. And beginning this spring, President Abbas began to systematically cut those forms of financial subsidies in a cynical and deliberate attempt to force Hamas to capitulate by hurting regular people. There's really no other way to describe it. And while I stand by my analysis that there's no scenario in which the people rise up against Hamas, they were aware of it and it was a problem. In part because the less money coming into Gaza, the less cash, the less liquidity in the system, the less taxes they can squeeze out of Gaza. And that was the calculation by President Abbas. So these financial sanctions he put in place in the spring were hurting Hamas. But there were a couple other things happening that I think were actually more important. One is that earlier this year, Hamas had internal elections. Periodically, Hamas has elections within itself, party elections. Those elections produced new leadership, a new chairperson of the Hamas Politburo, theoretically the senior-most Hamas official at the very top. And they also elected new leadership for Hamas in different territories. So the new leader for Hamas in Gaza, effectively the number 2 guy in Hamas, but for many reasons probably the most powerful person in the party, was a guy named Yahya Sinwar. Sinwar spent his adult life in an Israeli jail. He went to jail in the 80s and was only released in the 2011 prisoner exchange. But after he came out of jail, first of all, he had a history as one of the founders of the movement and the founders of its security apparatus. And then when he came out of jail, he positioned himself very effectively between Hamas's political and military wings. He amassed to himself a great deal of influence over both Hamas's political and military sides. And in the process, it seems, and I haven't met him, though I've met people close to him, that he positioned himself as a decision maker of some authority. And I emphasize that because Hamas is a part of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood around the world works on a very collective model of decision making. This used to frustrate President Carter to no end. He would, and I've been in many of these, he'd have these hours-long meetings with a big group, 5, 6, 7, 8 senior Hamas officials, and we would be pushing them to make policy changes, come out with this statement, say that you support a state in the West Bank and Gaza, the Arab Peace Initiative, and you could never get them in a room in that conversation to make a decision of that magnitude. They'd have to go back and they have to consult with Hamas people in Israeli prisons and people in the West Bank, and it is a long process to get them to make decisions of significance. Sinwar seems to have found a way to short-circuit some of that. And on top of that, he prioritized rebuilding Hamas's relationship with Egypt. So for years, after 2013, after President Morsi was overthrown in Cairo, Egypt deliberately and rather cynically demonized Hamas in the media. They blamed Hamas literally for everything under the sun. Part of Egypt's concerns had merit. Hamas was in some ways tied into the insurgency that Egypt was attempting to deal with in the Egyptian Sinai. Right? There has been an Islamic State-backed insurgency in the Sinai Peninsula for years. It's very ugly. Hamas, having old relationships with Bedouin in the Sinai and smuggling weapons through the Sinai, Hamas was in some ways complicit with that, even if ideologically they're very different from the Islamic State. So for years, when I would go to Egypt or talk to Egyptian officials about their Hamas policy and their closure of their border with Gaza, they wouldn't hear it. They say security, security, security. What? Hamas is aiding these insurgents in the Sinai. We have nothing to talk about. Sinwar was able to push through some policy changes for Hamas. He cracked down very hard on Salafi jihadist elements in Gaza who were tied into that insurgency in the Sinai. He seems to have cracked down hard on weapon smuggling. Hamas and Egypt are now coordinating very closely on security on both sides of the border. It appears Hamas has finally addressed Egypt's security concerns, some of which were legitimate. Hamas also, earlier this year, they put out a new policy document. And this document, years in the making and ostensibly the product of significant consensus within the party, did help to distance them from the Muslim Brotherhood, the arch nemesis of the regime in Cairo. And this helped. It helped provide a face-saving way for the Egyptian regime, in turn, to engage more constructively with Hamas in Gaza. And so through all that, Egypt recognized that it could catch more flies with honey than vinegar, that it would benefit Egypt's security to engage with Hamas. And it seems clear, just based on things President Sisi has said, that this is Egypt's way, this engagement right now on this Fatah-Hamas question, Palestinian reunification. It is Egypt's way of asserting itself as a player in the peace process. Sisi seems to be calculating that he's the guy who can bring the Palestinians together, and they need to be unified. This division in their own ranks has been enormously destructive to their own democracy, to civic participation. Palestinians desperately need a national conversation about where they're going, about their goals, and the Fatah-Hamas rift has been very toxic to that. So, if I want to wrap this up, there's a lot that could still go wrong here. We are a long way. This step toward the deployment on the borders is a long, long way from getting back to overdue Palestinian elections, from actually electing leadership with a democratic mandate. It's not even clear to me that Egypt would want that. But it is a very positive sign. And this is a process that our government, the US government, should support. It could lead to Palestinian democracy, which we should also support. And if it fails, all those factors I mentioned a moment ago come back into play. If this fails, given the concessions that Hamas has made, remember, the last time they made major concessions to their rivals in 2014, and that blew up, we had a war. If this fails, again, things in Gaza and things between Gaza and Israel could get very ugly. So I'll stop there. Thank you.